Chosen one, something about this moment carries a different kind of weight. You may not have words for it yet, but some quiet place inside, you recognized it before your mind ever tried to explain it. You did not arrive here by accident, and perhaps that is the first thing your heart needs to hear. Sometimes life reaches for us long before we realize we have been searching for it. Before you let your thoughts wander anywhere else, stay here with me for a little while. Let the noise around you settle, even if only for a few moments, because what this message carries deserves your full attention. I believe there are moments that divide a life into before and after, and this feels like one of them. There is something else you need to know. Long before this quiet moment, God had already been reaching toward you, not with a vague promise or an undefined hope, but with something deeply personal, something that fit the shape of your life more closely than you understood at the time. It came more than once, and each time it came close enough for your soul to recognize it, yet somehow it slipped through your hands before it could fully become your reality. If you've ever wondered why those moments felt unfinished, stay with me until the very end. Before this message is over, you'll begin to see those earlier seasons through different eyes. You'll understand why those doors seemed to open only to close again, why your heart kept returning to memories you thought you had already buried, and why this moment feels different from all the others. There is one memory that has never completely left you. Maybe it visits when the house is finally quiet, when you're lying awake long after everyone else has gone to sleep, or during those unexpected moments when your mind becomes still enough for old feelings to return. It isn't simply a memory, it carries a feeling that has never fully loosened its grip on your heart. You already know which moment I'm talking about. It may have been a conversation you never repeated to anyone, an opportunity you quietly walked away from, a dream you folded up and tucked somewhere deep inside yourself, because hoping again felt too vulnerable. Even now, when it returns, something in you still pauses. That was the first invitation. The first invitation rarely arrives with noise. It comes like a whisper you almost dismiss, a quiet pull that refuses to explain itself. Sometimes it looks like a door opening where you expected only another wall. Sometimes it feels like waking from a dream that somehow seems more real than the morning waiting outside your window. You felt something then. Even if you couldn't explain it, you knew life had brushed against something sacred. Yet you were still growing in ways that had nothing to do with age. Your spirit had recognized the invitation before your understanding knew how to carry it. Then another voice appeared. It sounded older, louder, more practical. It asked you to wait. It told you there would be another time, another season, another version of yourself who would be ready. So you placed that quiet stirring somewhere inside your heart and returned to what was familiar, believing you would find your way back when the timing finally made sense. Chosen one, that was never failure. It was the beginning of a conversation your soul had only just begun learning to hear. Think about Joseph. Before there was a palace, there was a dream. Before there was honor, there was misunderstanding. He carried a glimpse of his future before he possessed the wisdom to protect it, and the people closest to him could only respond from the limits of what they understood. The pit was never proof that the dream was false. It became part of the road that shaped the man who would one day carry it. The betrayal, the silence, the ache of realizing that someone you hoped would understand simply couldn't. Those moments did not erase his calling. They prepared him for it. Maybe the same is true for you. Whatever happened when that first door appeared, whatever caused you to step back, stay silent, or convince yourself that it belonged to someone else, that moment was never the ending you believed it was. It was the first page, and first pages often feel incomplete because they were never meant to tell the whole story. Can you remember how your heart felt then? Not what your mind concluded afterward, but what your heart knew before fear began speaking. There was a quiet certainty, almost impossible to describe, that rose inside your chest and gently whispered, "Pay attention." That feeling wasn't imagination, it was recognition. Recognition has a way of arriving before understanding. Sometimes your soul knows what your life is growing, toward long before your circumstances catch up. You caught a glimpse of something that truly belonged to you. But the version of you standing in that moment still needed time, experience, and deeper roots before you could carry its full weight. That isn't something to be ashamed of. Growth has its own pace, and God has always understood the difference between desire and readiness. The invitation was real, even if the season wasn't complete, so the first encounter became a seed instead of a harvest. While you were living through confusion, disappointment, long stretches of silence, and seasons that seemed to produce nothing at all, something beneath the surface kept growing. Even on mornings when you wondered whether heaven still remembered your name, the seed remained alive. Quietly, patiently, beyond anything your eyes could measure, it was becoming strong enough for the season you are standing in now. Chosen one, what was planted all those years ago has never stopped growing. What you're receiving tonight isn't something brand new. It's the harvest of a seed that was planted long ago, long before you understood why certain moments refused to leave your memory. The story has been unfolding quietly beneath the surface of your life for years, and perhaps for the first time, you're beginning to see where it has always been leading. Think about everything that happened between that first invitation and the place where you're standing today. Those years may have looked ordinary from the outside, even empty at times, but they were anything but empty. God was shaping parts of you that could only be formed slowly, pressing away what could not remain, strengthening what would one day carry the weight of what was prepared for you. Some lessons can only be learned in seasons that feel like they are standing still. You learned patience that wasn't built on convenience but on endurance. You learned how to keep believing when your circumstances spoke a language completely different from the quiet voice inside your heart, and somewhere along the way, you discovered that God's whisper often becomes clearest after every other voice has finally grown quiet. Those hidden years carried a kind of wisdom that cannot be rushed. They taught you how to recognize His presence in rooms where you once felt abandoned, and how to remain open even when nothing around you seemed to be changing. Looking back now, perhaps those seasons were never empty spaces to survive. Perhaps they were sacred ground all along. When Scripture says that God remembered Joseph, it doesn't describe someone who had been forgotten and suddenly came back into God's mind. The deeper meaning speaks of being marked, remembered with purpose, held in perfect timing until the appointed moment arrived. It carries the picture of a promise that never disappeared, even while it remained unseen. Chosen one, maybe your life has felt suspended between a promise and its fulfillment. Maybe you've wondered whether the silence meant you had somehow been overlooked. But what if the waiting was never absence? What if your name had always been held with intention, and every delay was quietly preparing you for a door that required the very person you were becoming? The wilderness has a way of stretching time until it feels endless, yet every difficult season leaves something behind: a deeper compassion, steadier faith, quieter strength, a heart that no longer depends on constant reassurance. Those gifts rarely arrive all at once, but they become part of you so gradually that one day you realize you're carrying a strength you never noticed being built. That is why the first invitation was never a failure. It was a beginning. Everything that grew afterward, every difficult conversation, every unanswered prayer, every unexpected delay, every quiet act of perseverance has been gathering into this moment. None of it has been separate. It has all belonged to the same unfolding story, like movements in a symphony that only reveal their beauty when heard together. If something inside you is quietly recognizing that truth, type Amen below. Not because the words make it true, but because your heart is remembering what it has been trying to hold on to all along. Now let's talk about the second and third invitations, because this is where many people begin telling themselves the wrong story. They look back and see the same door appearing again, the same hope returning, the same disappointment following close behind. After enough repetition, it's easy to wonder whether the problem was never the season but themselves. That quiet conclusion settles deeper than most people realize. It begins whispering that perhaps they simply weren't worthy, that maybe God kept trying, because they kept falling short. Over time, disappointment stops feeling like an experience and begins feeling like an identity. Chosen one, that is one of the heaviest burdens a heart can carry. When you expect another closed door, you instinctively stop reaching with open hands. You brace yourself before anything has even happened, protecting yourself from pain that hasn't arrived yet. But a guarded heart often struggles to receive what it has spent years preparing for, because it has forgotten what hope feels like. The second invitation did not come because God had lost patience with you. It came because his faithfulness had not changed. He already knew what had been planted inside you, even when you couldn't see it clear to yourself, and he continued drawing near because he could see the person you were still becoming. Think about who you were the second time that door appeared. You weren't the same person anymore. You carried a little more wisdom, a little more humility, and questions that ran much deeper than before. You still weren't fully ready, but you were no longer standing where you had once been. Something else had begun growing inside you. You were learning discernment. You were beginning to recognize your own heart, to notice the difference between fear and wisdom, between other people's expectations and the quiet conviction God had placed within you. That kind of knowing cannot be borrowed. It has to be lived. Then came the third invitation. By then, the excitement of the beginning had faded, and even the hope that comes with a second chance had become heavier. This was a different kind of exhaustion. It wasn't simply that your body felt tired. It was the weariness that comes from carrying hope through seasons where nothing seems to change. Maybe you've known that feeling. The kind that sits quietly behind your smile. The kind that makes you wonder if believing one more time is worth the risk of another disappointment. Yet God met you there. He didn't wait until your strength returned. He stepped into the very season where you felt you had almost nothing left to give, not to place another burden on your shoulders, but to reveal something hidden beneath all the fatigue. Because underneath the disappointment, underneath every unanswered question, underneath every time you almost convinced yourself to stop hoping, something inside you was still turning toward the light. It was quiet. It was bruised. It was tired, but it was still saying yes. That quiet yes wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't blind optimism or personality. It was something far deeper, a holy persistence placed within you long before you understood why you couldn't completely let go. It is one of the quiet signatures of a chosen one, not the absence of weariness, but the presence of a hope that somehow survives it. Esther's story carries that same quiet truth. Before history remembered her courage, she spent years simply occupying a place she never imagined for herself. She stood close to influence without yet understanding why she had been brought there, living in a season that looked ordinary, while heaven was quietly arranging something much greater. Then everything changed. The moment finally arrived, and it didn't come wrapped in comfort. It arrived carrying the weight of an impossible choice. The kind of moment that asks every fearful part of you whether you'll step forward or retreat. When Mordecai spoke to Esther, his words carried more than encouragement. They carried the quiet certainty that her entire journey had been leading to a single moment. He wasn't asking her to imagine a possibility. He was inviting her to recognize what had already been unfolding beneath every unexpected turn in her life. Esther didn't step into that room because she suddenly became fearless. She walked in because the hidden work had already been done within her. Long before anyone saw her courage, there had been private seasons of surrender, waiting, questioning, and quiet obedience that shaped a heart capable of carrying what her future would require. Chosen one, the same is true for you. The second and third invitations formed something inside you that couldn't have been created any other way. They taught you to remain faithful when nothing around you seemed to confirm what your heart still believed. They gave you a quiet resilience, the kind that survives after excitement has faded, and only conviction remains. Along the way, you also released things that would have become too heavy to carry into your next season. Some of it was pride. Some of it was the exhausting need to be understood by people who were never meant to understand your journey. Some of it was the habit of measuring your worth by someone else's approval. At the time, those losses felt painful. Looking back, they were making room. Sometimes God prepares us by adding strength. Sometimes He prepares us by gently removing everything that would keep us from walking freely. There are seasons where becoming lighter is the greatest gift we could receive, even though it rarely feels like one while we're living through it. There were people who watched your journey and quietly formed conclusions about it. They saw doors open and close. They saw plans change. They watched you begin again more than once. And from the outside they decided the dream had failed, or that perhaps you had misunderstood what your life was meant to be. Even if they never spoke every thought aloud, part of those voices found their way into your own heart. Maybe you've heard them echo back during quiet nights. Maybe you've caught yourself wondering whether they were right after all. Maybe the loudest doubt you carry doesn't even sound like fear anymore. It sounds reasonable. It sounds cautious. It sounds like your own voice. But chosen one, not every voice that lives in your mind was born there. Some doubts are simply the weight of other people's unfinished understanding resting on a story they were never meant to interpret. They saw one chapter and believed they knew the ending. They never witnessed everything that was happening beneath the surface. The slow work that only God could see while you were still becoming the person your calling required. What looked like delay was never empty space. It was quiet preparation. Every season that felt as though nothing was moving was slowly arranging pieces you could not yet see, and only now are those scattered moments beginning to form a picture. There is another truth hidden inside those years. Beneath every disappointment, there remained a part of you that refused to stop believing completely. Maybe it became quieter. Maybe it grew cautious. Maybe it stopped speaking out loud. But it never disappeared. Think about a child before the world teaches them what should be impossible. They reach with open hands. They ask impossible questions. They believe beauty can still surprise them. Somewhere underneath every disappointment you've carried, that part of you has continued waiting with remarkable patience. Perhaps that is what has protected you all along. Not perfect confidence, not constant strength, simply the quiet willingness to keep your heart from closing completely. That hidden openness became one of the greatest gifts your waiting produced. Now we come to the fourth invitation. This one is different. It deserves to be approached gently because it is often the hardest season to revisit. The fourth invitation came so close that for a while you could almost feel your life changing. You recognized it almost immediately because you had learned the language of these moments. Your heart knew the feeling before your mind could explain it. Everything seemed to be moving into place. Doors began opening that had remained closed for years. New conversations appeared. Unexpected connections formed. For the first time in a long while, it felt as though every difficult season had finally been leading here. You allowed yourself to hope again, not carelessly, carefully, quietly, with the tenderness of someone who had learned how much hope can cost. And then, just when it seemed the breakthrough had finally arrived, something shifted. Then something happened that made no sense. The momentum slowed. What had felt so close that you could almost touch it suddenly drifted just beyond your reach again. This time, though, the hardest voice wasn't coming from people around you. It rose quietly from within, sounding so familiar that you almost believed it belonged to you. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I misunderstood everything. Maybe I've hoped for too much. Chosen one, this is the part of the journey that deserves the most compassion. The fourth attempt wasn't heaven pulling away from you. It was the moment when the deepest wound finally came into the light. What still needed healing could no longer remain hidden, because you cannot step fully into what has been prepared while secretly believing you were never meant to receive it. The hardest lie rarely sounds dramatic. It doesn't shout. It settles into ordinary thoughts until they begin to feel like wisdom. It says, be thankful for what you have. And gratitude is beautiful. But underneath that gratitude, another sentence quietly forms. This is probably as much as someone like me should expect. That quiet conclusion is what the fourth season revealed. Take a moment and think about where your own heart felt the greatest resistance. It was never random. The place where doubt grew strongest was often the very place your heart cared about most. If you longed for purpose, doubt questioned whether your life truly mattered. If you longed to be seen, it whispered that being visible would only bring pain. If you carried a dream for years, it slowly convinced you that perhaps it belonged to someone else instead. The struggle wasn't exposing your weakness. It was revealing exactly what still needed to be released. Every season before this had already lifted something from your shoulders. The first invitation humbled you. The second loosened your dependence on other people's approval. The third taught you to keep walking, even when nothing unfolded the way you imagined. Then the fourth reached beneath all of that and uncovered the oldest fear of all, the quiet belief that somehow you were never enough for what your own heart had been reaching toward. Chosen one, hear this slowly. You are allowed to be tired and still be standing. You are allowed to carry scars without believing those scars have become your identity. You are allowed to arrive here with questions still unanswered, memories that still ache, and a heart that has learned caution through experience. None of those things erase what God has been patiently shaping within you. You do not have to become someone else before you are worthy of the next step. The person who has survived every season until now is the very person this journey has been forming. If something inside you quietly recognized that truth, type "I receive this" below. Sometimes the smallest act of agreement reminds your own heart of what it has almost forgotten. There is one more thing I want you to notice about this pattern of doubt. It almost never introduces itself as fear. It arrives sounding responsible. It sounds mature. It tells you to lower your expectations so disappointment won't hurt as much next time. It encourages you to settle for something smaller because smaller feels safer than hoping again. Perhaps you've heard that voice before. Perhaps you've mistaken it for wisdom. But wisdom brings peace. Fear disguised as wisdom slowly convinces you to expect less from your own life. The deepest restoration begins when that quiet agreement is broken. Think about the heart of a child for a moment. Before disappointment teaches caution, a child reaches with open hands. A child asks impossible questions without embarrassment. A child believes there is always one more reason to wonder, one more reason to trust, one more reason to take another step. Somewhere beneath everything you've endured, that part of you is still alive. It may have become quieter. It may have learned to protect itself, but it has never completely disappeared. Perhaps that is why this message found you today. Not because you needed someone to give you another promise, but because you needed to remember the part of yourself that never truly stopped reaching toward hope, even after life became heavy. Stay with me, chosen one. We're approaching the place where every part of this story begins to come together. Every chosen one eventually reaches a moment that cannot be crossed through effort alone. There comes a point where determination, planning, and striving simply cannot carry you any farther. Standing there can feel impossible, because the distance between where you are and what you've been called toward suddenly feels larger than anything you can overcome on your own. Yet perhaps that impossible place was never the end of the road. Perhaps it was the place every previous season had been quietly leading you. Because the fifth attempt doesn't arrive like another invitation waiting for your response. It arrives with the quiet certainty of a declaration. Looking back, every closed door, every delay, every return, every painful season was removing another layer that could never travel with you into what comes next. And now, chosen one, there is less standing between your heart and what God has been preparing than there has ever been before. What is waiting ahead of you isn't another glimpse of hope that disappears the moment you reach for it. It isn't another season of almost, or another promise that remains just beyond your grasp. What God has been preparing through every chapter of your journey carries a sense of completion, the kind that allows scattered pieces of your story to finally recognize one another. This is the moment where so many things begin to make sense. Looking back, those 4 attempts were never evidence that you had failed. They were moments when God refused to let you settle for something that looked close enough, but was never truly meant for you. Sometimes the most loving answer isn't immediate fulfillment. Sometimes it is the quiet closing of every door that would have kept you from the one prepared for your life. Think about the relationships that ended even though you prayed they would stay. Think about the opportunities that seemed perfect until they quietly dissolved in your hands. Think about the plans you mourned because you believed they were your future. Perhaps they weren't taken from you to leave you empty. Perhaps they were gently making room for something your heart could not yet recognize. The same is true of the paths you once believed would lead you where you were meant to go. Some of them had to come to their natural ending, so your heart would become willing to recognize a direction you might have resisted before. Looking back is painful at times, but sometimes hindsight reveals mercy where disappointment once lived. Chosen one, this is why the 5th attempt feels different. It isn't different because God suddenly decided to bless you. It feels different because you are no longer the same person who stood before the first door. Every season has quietly removed something that no longer belonged. Every disappointment stripped away another false conclusion. Every unanswered question loosened your dependence on certainty until faith became something deeper than immediate results. The person listening to these words today has been shaped by every one of those seasons. The parts of you built on fear have been worn away. The expectations that depended on appearances have softened. The need to control every outcome has slowly given way to a quieter trust, even if you didn't realize it was happening. So let me remind you who you are, chosen one, not through the lens of disappointment, but through the lens of everything God has been patiently forming. You have always sensed things before you could explain them. There were moments when your heart noticed a shift long before your circumstances reflected it. That doesn't make you strange. It means you spent years learning to recognize quiet movements that cannot always be measured by what others see. You carry light into places without trying to become the center of attention. Sometimes people leave your presence feeling calmer, more hopeful, or somehow understood, even when very few words were spoken. You may never hear them say it, but your presence has often mattered more than you realized. You have also learned to interrupt patterns that once seemed permanent. Maybe you're the first in your family to ask different questions, to choose healing over silence, forgiveness over bitterness, faith over fear. Those choices are rarely loud, yet they echo far beyond the moment they are made. There are places God is leading you that few people around you will fully understand. That can feel lonely at times. You may search for someone who can hand you a map, only to discover that the road ahead asks you to trust more than compare. Sometimes pioneers don't receive detailed directions because part of their calling is discovering the path as they walk it. And you have endured more than you give yourself credit for. There were nights when continuing would have been easier to abandon than to embrace. There were mornings when simply choosing hope again became an act of quiet courage. Yet here you are, still listening, still seeking, still willing to believe that your story is larger than the hardest chapter you've lived through. That isn't empty encouragement. It is the evidence of a heart that has continued responding to God even while carrying unanswered questions. There is something else I want you to notice before we continue. One of the greatest losses many people experience isn't the loss of opportunity. It is the gradual loss of wonder. Life teaches us to calculate, to protect ourselves, to expect less so, disrespect less so, disappointment hurts less. Over time, we become skilled at surviving, yet we slowly forget what it feels like to approach life with open hands. But somewhere beneath every difficult season, that childlike openness still remains, the part of you that once believed beauty could appear without warning. The part of you that trusted before fear taught caution. The part of you that looked toward tomorrow with quiet expectation instead of constant calculation. Perhaps the journey has never been about becoming someone entirely different. Perhaps it has been about gently uncovering the person God placed within you before the noise of the world convinced you to hide that part of yourself. Hold on to that thought, chosen one. It will matter more than you realize as this message continues. Chosen one, after everything you've walked through, I don't believe your heart needs another technique as much as it needs permission to become open again. Somewhere along the way, survival taught you to tighten your grip on everything. You learned to calculate every step, protect every hope, and expect less than your heart once believed was possible. Little by little, caution began to feel wiser than wonder, and protecting yourself started to feel safer than trusting again. After carrying life that way for so long, it's understandable if your spirit has forgotten what openness feels like. Yet there is a quieter way of living that many people forget exists. Think about the child you once were, before disappointment convinced you that every blessing had to be earned, before every act of trust became a negotiation with fear. That child wasn't naive. That child simply knew how to receive life with open hands. There was a time when joy arrived without permission, when hope didn't need evidence before it dared to believe, and when tomorrow felt like possibility instead of pressure. Perhaps this is what your journey has really been, restoring all along. Not a return to immaturity, but a return to wonder. Not an escape from reality, but the quiet courage to believe that God's goodness is still able to surprise you, even after everything you've experienced. Sometimes restoration looks less like becoming stronger and more like becoming softer in the places life convinced you to harden. Sometimes healing sounds less like certainty and more like the quiet willingness to hope again. The world often teaches us to live with closed hands. It rewards striving, constant proving, and endless comparison, until we begin believing that peace must be earned and that love only arrives after enough effort. After living that way for years, it's understandable if receiving feels unfamiliar. We become experts at carrying burdens and beginners at laying them down. We learn how to survive almost everything except the silence that asks us to trust. But God's work within you has always moved in the opposite direction. Little by little, every difficult season has been loosening the grip of fear. Every unanswered prayer has been inviting you into a deeper trust than certainty could ever produce. Every delay has been gently asking you to release the exhausting belief that your future depends entirely on your own strength. Even when nothing seemed to be changing around you, something was quietly changing within you. The places that once reacted with panic slowly began learning the language of peace. Chosen one, maybe the deepest restoration isn't found in becoming someone new. Maybe it is found in remembering the person God first breathed into existence before shame, disappointment, and survival convinced you to hide that part of yourself. The truest version of you was never lost. It was simply waiting beneath the layers life kept adding, waiting for the moment you would recognize it again, with gentleness instead of fear. Jesus spoke about becoming like little children, not because children understand everything, but because they still know how to receive without endlessly calculating whether they deserve what is being given. They reach before they overthink. They trust before fear teaches them another language. They are present before anxiety pulls them into imagined tomorrows. There is a quiet wisdom in that openness that adulthood often forgets. There is something profoundly healing about that image. Imagine laying down, even for a moment, the constant pressure to prove yourself. Imagine standing before God without rehearsing your worthiness, without trying to earn what grace has already chosen to give. Imagine allowing hope to breathe again without demanding that it justify itself first. Imagine discovering that acceptance was never something you had to manufacture. It was something waiting patiently for you to receive. That is the posture this wilderness has been quietly forming within you. The 4 attempts were never preparing you to depend on something outside yourself. They were preparing your heart. They were teaching you how to recognize the difference between striving and surrender, between fear and trust, between holding on so tightly that you cannot receive and opening your hands with quiet confidence. Every season carried a lesson your future would eventually need. Every disappointment slowly removed another layer that could never travel with you into what comes next. Chosen one, this is why your waiting has mattered. It was never only about reaching a destination. It was about becoming the kind of person who could stand before the promise with a peaceful heart instead of an anxious one. And before this message comes to its close, there is one more truth I want to leave with you. The wilderness did not simply prepare you for what was coming, it prepared you for the posture with which you would receive it. Chosen one, learning to receive is never passive. It is one of the deepest expressions of trust a heart can make. It is the quiet decision to stop chasing what God has already been preparing, to loosen your grip on fear, and to believe that what is meant for you does not require you to become someone else before you are allowed to receive it. Real trust often looks surprisingly ordinary. It looks like waking up one more morning without demanding every answer before taking the next faithful step. There comes a moment when you no longer perform for people who were never meant to decide your worth. You stop shrinking your calling so it feels comfortable to everyone around you, and you stop apologizing for the hope God placed inside your heart. Instead, you stand before the door that has always belonged to your story, not with perfect confidence, but with a quiet peace that says, "I am willing." Courage rarely arrives as loud certainty. More often, it arrives as a calm decision to keep walking, even while your heart is still trembling. This is what the 4 seasons have been teaching you. Chosen one, the first awakened your heart to the reality of the calling. The second reminded you that the invitation was deeply personal. The third proved that hope could survive even when your strength felt exhausted. The fourth uncovered the lie that whispered you would never be enough, so it could finally lose its hold over you. Looking back now, each season carries a meaning the others could never have revealed by themselves. And now comes the 5th, not another promise waiting somewhere in the future. Not another season that asks you to keep postponing your life. This moment invites you to walk forward as the person these years have been patiently shaping, carrying your history without allowing it to define your future. You don't arrive here because everything became easy. You arrive here because everything difficult has quietly prepared your heart to recognize what once would have passed you by. Before we go any farther, let yourself become still for a moment. Take one slow, unhurried breath, the kind of breath that comes after setting down something you have carried for far too long. Perhaps what you're laying down today isn't the pain itself. Perhaps it's the belief that the pain meant something was wrong with you. Maybe the heaviest burden was never the waiting, but the conclusion you quietly reached because of it. Maybe you've spent years carrying a story about yourself that God never wrote. Today is an invitation to loosen your grip on that story. Let that burden rest here. You were never being measured by your delays. You were never being rejected because the timing was different from what you expected. Those conclusions were never the truth. They were simply stories fear learned to tell while you were still waiting for understanding. Chosen one, you are not standing here by yourself. Across countless quiet rooms, there are hearts carrying questions that sound remarkably like yours. There are people who have smiled through their days while privately wondering if this next season could truly be different. There are people who have learned to hide their weariness behind ordinary conversations because they no longer know how to explain what they are carrying. If you have ever felt unseen in that quiet struggle, know that you are far from alone. If someone comes to your mind right now, someone who has grown unusually quiet or who seems to be carrying a weight they cannot quite explain, share this message with them. Not because they owe you a response, but because light was never meant to remain hidden. Light naturally finds the places where hope has grown dim. Sometimes a single reminder arrives at exactly the moment another heart was about to stop believing. Now let us bring this moment before God. Father, you have seen every mile of this journey. You have seen the hidden tears, the silent prayers, the hopes that were carried long after they made no sense to anyone else. You have witnessed the endurance it took for these chosen ones to keep saying yes, even when they could not yet see where the road was leading. You have remained faithful in every quiet season when your work was invisible but never absent. Today I place every false conclusion into your hands. I release the belief that delay means rejection. I release the belief that repeated disappointment defines a person's future. I release the quiet voice that has whispered, maybe this promise belongs to someone else. I release every burden that was never meant to become part of their identity. And in its place, I receive what has always been true. The waiting was not wasted. The wilderness was not punishment. The 4 attempts were never 4 failures. They were 4 seasons of formation, and that work has not been in vain. Chosen one, hear these words with your heart more than your mind. Let them settle beneath the noise of old fears and familiar doubts. Some truths need time to travel from the mind into the soul, and this is one of them. You have walked through fire without allowing it to extinguish the deepest part of who God created you to be. You have continued searching for light through seasons when you could barely see your own next step. You have carried hope quietly when very few people understood why you refused to let it go. Even on the days when you questioned yourself, something deeper continued reaching toward God. You have broken patterns simply by choosing healing where fear expected repetition. You have continued walking roads that few people around you could explain, because your journey has never depended on popular understanding. And even after everything you've endured, something within you has continued answering God with a quiet yes. That quiet yes has become stronger than you realize, because it has survived disappointment without surrendering its tenderness. That quiet yes is beautiful. It is evidence that His work within you never stopped. Chosen one, the word spoken over your life was never almost. It was never perhaps. It was never if you become enough. Long before you understood your own story, God already knew the person you would become through every season that shaped you. He saw every detour before you walked it, every tear before it fell, every victory before you recognized it yourself. You are not too late. You are not forgotten. You are not disqualified by your past, your questions, your scars, or your weariness. You are standing here as the person this journey has been forming from the very beginning, before fear tried to convince you to forget who you were. The story that once looked unfinished is beginning to reveal its deeper meaning. What once felt like scattered chapters now belongs to one unfolding testimony of grace. So receive this moment with open hands. Receive it with a quieter heart. Receive it knowing that every step has brought you here for a reason, and may the peace of God settle gently over everything your heart is still learning to trust.